This is a continuation on the series on U.S. foreign policy. I left off last time talking about President Woodrow Wilson and his alter ego, second personality, Colonel Mandel House, and his influence on Wilson and the beginning of the Federal Reserve and the beginning, of course, of the income tax in the United States as well. So today I'm going to continue talking about the U.S. foreign policy and the development of U.S. foreign policy by talking about the robber barons. And depending on your viewpoint, during the industrial age, the either robber barons or captains of industry gained power and influence over the U.S. economy. They did this by dividing up areas of the economy amongst themselves, and they would sit as private investment clients on each other's board of directors. They were referred to as high net worth individuals. Many of them were Yale graduates and members of the Society of Skull and Bones, the Brotherhood of Death. For more information on that, you can see my video on Professor Anthony Sutton's book on the Order of Skull and Bones. The high net worth individuals married each other's family members and were able to provide trusts that disguised who was putting the money into those trusts. An important investment firm was called Brown Brothers Harriman. This investment firm had custody of $3.3 trillion in trust and administered another $1.2 trillion. A law firm called Sullivan and Cromwell on Wall Street represented these individuals and their corporations. And we're talking about some of the same names coming into play here that came into play during the time of World War I and the time of the era of the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, the Fords, and the rise of the industrialists. Who were the Dulles brothers? The lawyer for the firm of Brown Brothers Harriman at this time was Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles became the first director of the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA. His brother, John Foster Dulles, was Secretary of State under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, and their grandfather, John W. Foster, had been Secretary of State under President Benjamin Harrison. That was the time when the United States was involved in gaining an imperialistic empire during the time of the Spanish-American War, when the United States acquired Hawaii, the Philippines, Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and other possessions that at one time belonged to Spain in around 1898. And so it's quite extraordinary, actually, that these same people from the same family are dominating the U.S. Department of State at that time. And the two books on this page were great sources for me when I was doing my research on U.S. foreign policy. The first one is called The Brothers. It was written by a man by the name of Stephen Kinzer, and it's called John Foster Dulles, Allen Dulles, and Their Secret World War. The other one was written by a man by the name of David Talbot, and it's called The Devil's Chessboard, Allen Dulles, the CIA, and the Rise of America's Secret Government. And of course, I will have a lot more to say about the CIA and its covert operations in the continuation of this series on U.S. foreign policies. But I think it's quite extraordinary that two brothers would be Secretary of State and Director of the Central Intelligence Agency at the same time. So it's important to understand who these men were. And these two men, the Dulles brothers, John Foster and Allen, attended the Versailles Conference after World War I as lawyers. They helped to make sure that Germany would be required to pay war reparations to the companies that had been damaged in the war, according to Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles. Allen Dulles, on behalf of the law firm Sullivan and Cromwell, also became the lawyer for Germany. He negotiated loans that were going to be loaned to Germany by the clients of the private investors of Brown Brothers Harriman investment firm. Therefore, Allen Dulles was the lawyer for Brown Brothers Harriman as well as the lawyer for the government of Germany. The loans were being used to pay back the war damages that had been imposed upon Germany. The German government would make available German bonds, and these would be purchased by the investment clients of Brown Brothers Harriman at the recommendation of course, Allen Dulles, who was the lawyer for the German government. The investors would buy the bonds, which are in effect loans, giving money to the German government, and the German government then used it to rebuild their military and industry. Therefore, the private investors in Brown Brothers Harriman, and then we're talking about men like John D. Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, E.H. Harriman, helped to refinance the building of Germany as a massive military power after it had been just defeated. In addition, they could make millions of dollars buying into the major industries in Germany, which they did. And the chief executive officer of Brown Brothers Harriman was none other than George Herbert Walker, the grandfather of future President George Herbert Walker Bush. Excellent sources for all of this are Professor Antony Sutton's books. And I've talked about Professor Antony Sutton before, and I'll be talking about him again. But on this particular slide, I'm showing you, he wrote a series called Western Technology, Soviet Economic Development, 1930 to 1945, where he details much data on how the United States and Western countries actually gave technology to the Soviet Union, and that without the process having taken place, the Soviet Union probably would have never survived and would have crumbled. And the other book on this particular page is called National Suicide, Military Aid to the Soviet Union, where Professor Sutton uncovers how the United States was giving technology to the Soviet Union, which was being used to further the aims of North Vietnam during the Vietnam War, and therefore being used to target directly against United States soldiers. So these two books are very, very important sources. What was the end game of all of this? This process led to the development of a mechanism for transferring billions of dollars of wealth out of the United States from the multi-billionaires into Germany to rebuild the German industry and war machine, to combat the rise of Bolshevism, and to keep socialism and communism from coming into Europe. The revolutionaries in Russia in 1917 were also funded by Wall Street corporations. So Professor Antony Sutton has also written a book called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution, in which he uncovers the fact that the Bolsheviks were being financed by these industrialized at the same time that they were also funding, you guessed it, Adolf Hitler and his rise to power. So this is another of Antony Sutton's very, very important books. This one's called Wall Street and the Rise of Hitler. Continue with the story. George Herbert Walker stepped down as CEO of Brown Brothers Harriman after the loan process was set up, and his son, Prescott Bush, became chief executive officer. Union Bank of New York was capitalized, and they set up a chapter of the bank in the Netherlands called the Bank of Shipping and Commerce, under the control of a man by the name of Fritz Thyssen. They began to give loans from this bank into the Nazi Party in Germany. In 1952, Prescott Bush was elected to the U.S. Senate. Of course, no press accounts appeared exposing the Bush-Nazi connection. And Fritz Thyssen also has written a book called I Paid Hitler. And it's a very interesting little book to read. It details the story of Fritz Thyssen, who was a German industrialist, and how he lent money to the German war effort in the development up before World War II. And that is another book that is difficult to find. I think I found my copy of that one again from the Library of India. There's another important book on this same topic that is called Hitler's Secret Backers, and I'll be talking about these books a little bit later on as well. So on January 3rd, 1933, an important meeting took place in Germany. John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles represented the private investment clients of Brown Brothers Harriman and had a chance to have a face-to-face meeting with Adolf Hitler. Hitler signed an agreement to take responsibility to repay the loans given to the German government by the investors of Brown Brothers Harriman, and the Dulles brothers in turn gave the green light to Hitler being made Chancellor of Germany. All this was done with the cooperation of about 30 men who were investors in Brown Brothers Harriman. Major stockholders in 50 corporations in the U.S. had functionally monopolized major industries such as iron, steel, railroad, shipping lines, pharmaceuticals, and agricultural industry. These companies bought the companies in Germany and had them act as subsidiaries. They made millions of dollars in profit with war machinery being purchased by the German government using loans given to them by Brown Brothers Harriman. Between these years, then, there was a merry-go-round of capital flowing out of the U.S. into Germany and then generating additional billions of dollars of profit for the investors. These 30 to 40 individuals had thus set up a mechanism to enrich themselves and to dominate the foreign policy of the United States. When Hitler invaded Poland, these individuals mobilized and pushed back against the entrance of the U.S. into the war. When FDR was elected in 1932, the men from Brown Brothers Harriman organized under J.P. Morgan and attempted a military coup d'etat against FDR. Remember the story of Smedley Butler and the plot to seize the White House? Charles Murphy, the chief of staff for J.P. Morgan, approached Commandant Marine Corps Major General Smedley Butler and asked him to lead a coup d'etat against FDR. Butler refused and instead went to Congress to expose the plot. The U.S. Congress held hearings and found the evidence was credible. The American Liberty League was the front for the coup. However, DuPont, Morgan, Rockefeller, etc. stood down, and FDR remained in power. This is another book that is very, very instrumental in understanding this whole period of U.S. history, especially the suppressed history that you will never read about in textbooks. The group that I was just discussing continued to fund the Nazi Party even after Germany declared war on the U.S. This was confirmed in a U.S. Congressional Committee under the Trading with the Enemy Act. There was a vesting order that ordered the seizure of a number of corporations that were owned by Prescott Bush and Herbert Walker and other private investors of Brown Brothers Harriman. A full year into the war, the group was trading with the enemy and providing material support, including explosives through the DuPont Chemical Corporation, major amounts of iron and steel, petroleum, etc., that were essential for German military operations against the U.S. The men privately hired Allen Dulles, who was legal counsel to Brown Brothers Harriman, from Sullivan and Cromwell, to help mask their ownership of these companies. There is also a detailed account of this in a book called The Nazi Hydra in America, Suppressed History of a Century, and that's pages about 70 to 77. And then there's another book yet that deals with this subject called Trading with the Enemy by Charles Higham, and I'll have all of these books listed in the sources in the description of this video. So what did FDR do when he found out about the plot to seize the White House and the men that were involved? This is the interesting part. After he discovered the coup plot and the funding of the Third Reich by this group of people, he established a détente with the group. And instead of punishing them, he actually brought them into critical positions inside the U.S. war operations to allow themselves to, I guess, exonerate themselves from what they had been caught doing. Their job was to run the business end of the war, how to distribute weapons, etc. And so these individuals were located in strategic positions inside the U.S. government at the end of World War II. Secretary of War Henry Stimson's chief deputies were part of the Brown Brothers Harriman group and other investment firms. So these chief deputies of Secretary of War Henry Stimson were Robert Lovett, Robert Anderson, and John J. McCloy. And in the next series, I'm going to be talking about how Franklin D. Roosevelt creates the Office of Strategic Services, or the OSS, which is the forerunner of the Central Intelligence Agency. But just keep in mind that these individuals who were helping to fund not only the Bolsheviks in the Soviet Union, but Hitler's rise to power, are now being brought into strategic positions in the United States government and will be operating within United States foreign policy. And this is going to become extremely important when I start discussing the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and then of course all of the operations which came about as a result of that Cold War, like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and the drug trafficking that took place out of Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War, and many, many other covert CIA operations. So that's all for this time.